My father told everyone I was a disappointment, so I became more successful than he ever was. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, I always felt like I was walking on eggshells around my father. He had this way of making everything feel like a competition, and somehow I was always losing. Every family gathering, every dinner conversation, every casual encounter with neighbors turned into an opportunity for him to point out my shortcomings. While my older brother excelled in sports and academics, I was the kid who struggled with math, forgot to do chores, and preferred reading comic books to playing football. The worst part wasn't even the criticism itself, but how public he made it. At barbecues, he would tell anyone who would listen about how I got a C in algebra, or how I quit the baseball team after 2 weeks. He had this laugh that followed these stories, like my failures were entertainment for the adults around the backyard grill. I remember standing there, holding a paper plate with a burger I suddenly couldn't eat, watching him gesture with his beer bottle while explaining to my uncle why I would never amount to anything. High school was particularly brutal because everyone in our town knew everyone else's business. My father worked at the local hardware store, and it seemed like every customer got an update on my latest academic disaster or social awkwardness. I would walk into the grocery store and feel the weight of pitying looks from adults who had heard about my latest report card or my inability to get a date to the homecoming dance. The shame was suffocating, like wearing a sweater made of other people's disappointment. What made it worse was that I actually cared about his opinion more than I wanted to admit. Despite all the public humiliation, some part of me kept hoping that maybe if I just tried harder, if I just found the right thing to excel at, he would finally see me as worthy of his pride. I joined the debate team, thinking maybe intellectual pursuits would impress him, but he just made jokes about how I could argue with anyone about anything except the things that actually mattered. The breaking point came during my senior year when I was applying to colleges. I had been accepted to a decent state university. Nothing fancy but a solid school where I could study literature and maybe figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Instead of celebrating, he spent the entire evening at my graduation party telling relatives and family friends that I was probably going to drop out within a year because I had never shown any real commitment to anything. Standing in our backyard, surrounded by people who had watched me grow up, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, though that was part of it. It was more like a door slamming shut on the part of me that had been desperately seeking his approval for 18 years. I realized that nothing I did would ever be good enough for him, so I might as well stop trying to meet his expectations and start setting my own. College was like stepping into a completely different world, where nobody knew about my father's public assessments of my character. For the first time in my life, I could define myself without the constant background noise of his disappointment. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that surprised even me, not because I was trying to prove him wrong, but because I was finally free to discover what I was actually capable of when I wasn't paralyzed by the fear of public failure. My literature professors recognized something in me that I had never seen in myself. They encouraged me to think critically, to question assumptions, and to express ideas that felt authentic rather than safe. I started writing seriously, not just for assignments, but because I had things to say that felt important. The words flowed out of me like they had been dammed up for years, and suddenly I understood what passion felt like when it wasn't filtered through someone else's judgment. During my sophomore year, I started freelancing for a local magazine, writing articles about arts and culture events around campus. The work was challenging but exhilarating, and I discovered that I had a knack for finding interesting angles on seemingly ordinary stories. My editor was impressed enough to offer me a regular column, and suddenly I was earning money doing something I genuinely loved. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was succeeding in exactly the kind of impractical field my father had always warned me against. The real turning point came when I wrote a piece about how small-town dynamics affect young people's self-perception and ambition. I didn't mention my father specifically, but I drew on my own experiences of growing up under constant public scrutiny and judgment. The article resonated with readers in ways I hadn't expected, and it was picked up by a national publication. Suddenly, I had editors from major magazines reaching out, asking if I had more stories to tell. What started as a single freelance article turned into a regular stream of writing opportunities. I was contributing to publications I had only dreamed of reading, let alone writing for. The topics varied wildly, from profiles of interesting people to investigative pieces about social issues, but the common thread was my ability to find the human story within larger narratives. Each published piece felt like evidence that I had something valuable to offer the world, something that had nothing to do with my father's assessments of my worth. By my junior year, I was earning more from freelance writing than most of my classmates were making at their part-time jobs. More importantly, I was building a reputation as a reliable, insightful writer who could be trusted with important stories. Editors knew they could assign me a piece and expect something thoughtful and well-researched in return. The confidence I gained from this professional recognition started bleeding into other areas of my life. I graduated with honors, something that would have seemed impossible during my high school years when I was struggling just to maintain a C average. The university offered me a teaching assistantship for graduate school, but I decided to take a different path. A prestigious magazine in New York had offered me a staff position, and I knew this was my chance to really test myself in a competitive environment where my hometown reputation couldn't follow me. New York was overwhelming at first, but it was exactly the kind of challenge I needed. The magazine world was cutthroat and demanding, but I had learned to thrive under pressure rather than crumble beneath it. My colleagues were brilliant and ambitious, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged in a room full of successful people. I wasn't the disappointment or the underachiever. I was just another talented writer trying to make his mark. The work was intense but rewarding. I was assigned to cover everything from political scandals to cultural phenomena, and each story taught me something new about the world and about my own capabilities. My editors trusted me with increasingly important assignments, and I consistently delivered work that exceeded their expectations. Within 2 years, I had been promoted twice and was earning a salary that dwarfed what most people in my hometown made in a year. But the real breakthrough came when I was assigned to write a long-form piece about how family dynamics shape career choices and personal ambition. The research for this article forced me to examine my own relationship with my father more objectively, and I realized that his constant criticism had actually given me a peculiar kind of resilience. I had learned to persist in the face of disapproval, to find motivation in proving doubters wrong, and to define success on my own terms rather than accepting other people's definitions. The article was published as a cover story and generated more reader response than anything I had written before. People wrote to tell me about their own experiences with family members who had underestimated them, and I realized that my story wasn't unique. There were thousands of people out there who had been written off by the people who should have believed in them most, and who had found ways to succeed despite or perhaps because of that early lack of support. The success of that piece led to book deal offers from several major publishers. I spent months crafting a proposal for a book that would explore the psychology of family expectations and how they shape individual identity. The advance was substantial enough that I could afford to take a leave of absence from the magazine to focus on writing, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier when I was struggling to pass basic math classes. Writing the book was the most challenging and rewarding experience of my professional life. I interviewed dozens of people who had overcome early family skepticism to achieve success in various fields, and their stories convinced me that there was something almost universal about the experience of being underestimated by those closest to us. The book wasn't just about my father and me. It was about the broader human experience of proving ourselves worthy of respect and recognition. When the book was published, it became a bestseller within weeks. The media attention was overwhelming but gratifying, and I found myself doing interviews on television and radio shows, discussing the themes that had emerged from my research. The irony of discussing family disappointment on national television wasn't lost on me, especially when I thought about how my father used to complain about my communication skills to anyone who would listen. The book's success opened doors I hadn't even known existed. I was invited to speak at conferences, universities, and corporate events about resilience, family dynamics, and the psychology of success. Each speaking engagement paid more than my father had probably earned in a month at the hardware store. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that my ideas were resonating with people and potentially helping them navigate their own family challenges. What surprised me most was how the book's success changed my relationship with my hometown. People who had witnessed my father's public criticisms of me were now seeing interviews and articles about my achievements. The local newspaper ran a feature story about my success, and suddenly I was being held up as an example of local talent making it in the big city. The same people who had given me pitying looks in the grocery store were now asking when I might come back to visit and give a talk at the high school. My father's reaction to my success was complicated and, in some ways, more hurtful than his original criticism had been. Instead of acknowledging that he had been wrong about my potential, he began claiming credit for my achievements. He told people that his tough love approach had motivated me to succeed, that his criticism had been necessary to push me toward excellence. It was a revisionist history that conveniently ignored the years of genuine pain and self-doubt his words had caused. The most difficult part of my success was realizing that it hadn't fundamentally changed the dynamic between my father and me. Even with objective evidence of my achievements, he couldn't bring himself to simply admit that he had been wrong about me. Instead, he found new ways to minimize my accomplishments, or to suggest that they were somehow less impressive than they appeared. When I won a major journalism award, he pointed out that there were probably lots of people who deserved it more. When I bought a house in a nice neighborhood, he wondered aloud how I could afford the property taxes. But something had changed in me, even if it hadn't changed in him. His opinion no longer had the power to devastate me the way it had when I was younger. I had built a life and a career based on my own values and goals, and I had surrounded myself with people who saw and appreciated my actual qualities rather than my perceived shortcomings. The validation I had once desperately sought from him was now coming from sources that felt more authentic and meaningful. The real vindication came when I was invited to give the commencement address at my old high school. Standing on the same stage where I had graduated with so much uncertainty about my future, I looked out at an audience that included many of the same people who had listened to my father's predictions about my inevitable failure. I spoke about the importance of defining success for ourselves rather than accepting other people's definitions, and about the power of persistence in the face of doubt. After the speech, dozens of people approached me to share their own stories of being underestimated or dismissed by family members. Many of them thanked me for showing them that it was possible to succeed despite early lack of support. Some of the younger graduates told me that my story had given them permission to pursue their own dreams, even when the adults in their lives were skeptical about their chances. My father was in the audience that day, and I could see him struggling with the reality of my success. Here was undeniable proof that his predictions about my future had been spectacularly wrong, witnessed by hundreds of people who remembered his earlier assessments of my character. He couldn't revise this history or claim credit for this moment. This was my achievement earned through my own efforts and perseverance. In the years since that commencement speech, I have continued to build on my success as a writer and speaker. I have published 2 more books, both of which have been well received by critics and readers. I have been invited to speak at major conferences and universities across the country. I have built a life that feels authentic and fulfilling, surrounded by people who value my contributions and support my continued growth. The relationship with my father remains complicated, but it no longer defines my sense of self-worth. I have learned to see his criticism as a reflection of his own insecurities and limitations, rather than as an accurate assessment of my potential. His inability to acknowledge my success says more about him than it does about me, and I have made peace with the fact that his approval was never really available to me regardless of what I achieved. Looking back, I can see that his constant criticism actually gave me some unexpected gifts. It taught me to be self-reliant and to find motivation from within rather than depending on external validation. It showed me the importance of treating others with respect and encouragement, especially young people who are still figuring out who they want to become. Most importantly, it demonstrated that other people's opinions of us, even those of our family members, are not necessarily accurate or definitive. The young man who stood in that backyard during his graduation party, listening to his father predict his inevitable failure, could never have imagined the life I have built for myself. That scared, insecure teenager who desperately wanted his father's approval has become a confident adult who knows his own worth and doesn't need anyone else's permission to pursue his dreams. The transformation wasn't easy or quick, but it was possible, and it was worth every moment of struggle along the way. My father told everyone I was a disappointment, and in doing so, he gave me the greatest gift he could have given me: the motivation to prove him wrong and the freedom to define success on my own terms. I became more successful than he ever was, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I finally learned to believe in myself.